Good morning. Ronald Coase lived 37,504 days on this planet, and he lived them splendidly. During some of those days, he wrote 2 of the most widely cited articles in the social sciences and more than 100 other scientific papers and books. He pioneered the field of law and economics. He edited the Journal of Law and Economics, building it to have enormous impact. He won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. He was the founding president of the International Society for New Institutional Economics. And at the age of 102, with his colleague Ning Wang, he published a book on the economic development of modern China. It won prizes across the world from London to Beijing. Days put to good use, wouldn't you say? It was my pleasure and privilege to know Ronald Coase for over 3 decades as remarkable scholar and remarkable friend. I'd like to share with you a few glimpses of his life experiences and his character. And as framework, I'll use a comment of his. Any subject is interesting if looked at carefully and in sufficient depth. Let's start with the first part. Any subject is interesting. It came as a shock when Ronald Coase told us that the issues he examined were determined completely by accident. One example of many. He began his study of broadcasting because he was assigned to teach public utilities at the London School of Economics. So he began by studying the post office and then broadcasting. This led eventually to his paper on the Federal Communications Commission and then to the problem of social cost. Among legal studies, the most widely cited paper of all time. From an accidental beginning, what a remarkable outcome. Another charming, homey example. Way back in 1938, to generate more housekeeping money after he married, he agreed to write a series of 12 articles on accounting for a London newspaper. The series was called Business Organization and the Accountant. Each week, the night before the article was due, he worked all night long, writing away. The next morning, exhausted, he would fall asleep, and his wife, Marion, would carry the manuscript off to the newspaper office, just in time. But even written in these circumstances, those newspaper articles developed important new ideas in accounting. They've been republished many times and were revisited at a major accounting conference held 50 years later. Coase's statement continues, any subject is interesting if looked at carefully. He was consummate in the care with which he looked at subjects. I once asked him, what was the most important idea you encountered during your undergraduate study? He answered, the eminent statistician, Sir Arthur Lyon Bowley, taught us, when you see a number in a table, ask yourself, what had to take place for that number to be entered in that column? And Ronald did that. He was meticulous about obtaining and examining evidence. John Maynard Keynes described the early life of Alfred Marshall in a sentence that Coase called a masterpiece of concealment. To resolve the issues around Marshall's background, in the 1980s, Coase set out to track down Marshall's original birth certificate from 1842 and the original census data sheets for 1871, 1881, and 1891. He scrutinized all those original records, the information, looked at the various handwritings in which they were recorded and the list of who was living in the household at each census period, and then traced out more carefully the steps of Marshall's history. What an extraordinary standard of detective work for most of us, but normal for Coase. When he was editor of the Journal of Law and Economics, he attended with care to every dimension of quality. He sought out promising research. He encouraged authors. He handled all the editorial tasks himself without delegating to assistants. And an amazing touch. For each issue, just before he delivered the final copy to the printers, he carried all the manuscripts over to the library of the University of Chicago, sat down, and he himself, the editor, checked every citation in every manuscript against the original sources in the library. In his last summer, he recalled that 40 years earlier, he had encountered only one manuscript in economics with all the references correct, a paper that Lee and I had done. We were thrilled. We were so thrilled. The final part of Coase's comment says, "Any subject is interesting if looked at carefully and in sufficient depth." As a young child, Coase got a chess set, but he had no one to play with. So he played chess against himself. He moved from side to side around the table, doing his best for each. Playing in that way, he surely began to think deeply about how the two parties' presence and actions affected each other reciprocally. Decades later, when asked how he came up with his ideas for the problem of social cost, he answered he had always held that perspective. It seemed obvious to him that the real question that has to be decided is, should A be allowed to harm B? Or should B be allowed to harm A? A perspective perhaps first shaped over a child's chessboard. In Britain, during World War II, he was chief statistician in the Central Statistical Office. He quickly saw and foresaw problems that others did not. When war began, he immediately realized that ocean shipping to Britain would be vastly curtailed by submarine attack. He therefore asked all the ministries to prioritize the imports they needed, so the most important items could be loaded on ships. All the ministries refused, saying, "Everything on my list is vitally important." So ships leaving foreign ports for Britain were simply loaded with whatever was on the dock at that moment. Later in the war, Coase noticed that fighting men were being sent to one front and most of the logistics to another. When he pointed this out, he was removed from that position. So Coase knew deeply firsthand the problems of coordination in bureaucracies. In his final summer, Lee and I visited him in his home. He was in his living room reading. At the age of 102, what was he reading? The two journals, Science and Nature. He said he wanted to understand how natural scientists go about drawing their conclusions. In addition to the power and elegance of Coase's intellectual life, there was the sheer delight of knowing him. He was a marvelous companion and raconteur. He loved art, the ballet, the landscapes of Provence, where he lived for many, many summers. He delighted in long conversations over good food. He spoke and wrote the way poets and mathematicians, the best of them, do. In a few words, capturing a realm of ideas or turning something on its head. His wit was disarming. As a keynote speaker, he told one audience, "After that introduction, you'll all be disappointed in me. But a person making an introduction is not under oath." Or, "I like crimes to be solved because of the cleverness of the police, not because of the stupidity of the criminals." He was tough. On September 11th, 2001, it fell to me to tell him about the terrorist attacks that day. We were speaking by phone, and he had heard no news. He listened to my intense account, stoically, impassively. At first, I was surprised, but then I recalled he had lived through years of terrible wartime destruction in London, nightly bombings, had seen from his windows buildings burning in every direction. And he had been the first civilian to fly into Germany after surrender, where he interviewed the men who had been the leaders of the German economy, all in prison. He was modest. In a speech to the International Society for New Institutional Economics, he said, "We do not know, for the most part, what is true or what is false, what is significant and what is not, nor the character of the interrelation of various parts of the institutional structure of the economy. It is our aim to find out." The quality he most valued in a person, he told me, was kindness, and he was kind lifelong. Early in life, as a very young scholar, he discovered a major error in a new book by a famous economist. His friends all urged him to publish that discovery immediately and make his name. But he thought the right thing to do was write to the author and let the author correct it in the next edition. And that's what Coase did. Late in life, he wanted to help new generations of students as he had been helped. During a cold, wintry week in the year 2000, Coase met with a few of us in a Chicago hotel room to found a new organization to work with young scholars worldwide. He permitted us to use his name for the Institute. He served as research advisor, and he donated much of his Nobel Prize money to provide fellowships for these young scholars. Coase said that he had been lucky in his life. The center of this was his wife, Marion. They met in 1932 when he was in Chicago as a student, married a few years later, and were always together until she passed away in 2012. 80 years they shared. Let me close with a vivid personal recollection from long ago. Imagine a summer night in the south of France. Ronald and Marion were there, Lee and I with them. Dinner was in a restaurant in an ancient hilltop village, Roquebrune. After midnight, we finally began the long walk downhill home. Fireflies and stars were shining, but no moon. We reached an ancient marble staircase leading down the steep hillside. Suddenly, Ronald and Marion linked their arms through ours and led us, singing and dancing, down that long marble staircase toward the sea, the two of them smiling their radiant, incandescent smiles. I think of their smiles now. Happy trails to you, Ronald Coase. Thanks for everything.